Hello and welcome to the latest iteration of our Expert Dispatch series. My name is Ms Elizabeth Threlkeld and I'm a research assistant here at Center for Strategic and Contemporary Research. CSCR is an independent policy institute which looks at issues of domestic and international relevance to Pakistan. The Our Expert Dispatch series is one in which we invite policy and research experts to know their views on issues of both domestic and international relevance, especially those which affect Pakistan. I'm delighted to introduce our guest for today, Ms Elizabeth Threlkeld, Ms Threlkeld is a senior fellow and director at the South Asia program for the Stimson Center. Good morning, Ms Threlkeld.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for staying late for this conversation.
No problem at all. Ms Threlkeld, my first question to you is the US and Pakistan last month celebrated 75 years of diplomatic relations. These relations saw both highs and lows, the highs being during the Cold War and the lows in the period following the Cold War. So with keeping in mind the past 75 years, what do you think both states could have done differently in order to have a robust and multifaceted partnership? And what do you think the plan of action should be from now?
Well, thanks very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you and for this question, which is something that I've been giving quite a bit of thought to. I was actually in Islamabad last month in September for a conference that was co-hosted by the US Embassy and Quaid-e-Azam University on the 75 years of bilateral ties. And as part of that process, I took a look back at the history of the two sides. And I think I might try to add a little bit more nuance to kind of the overall scope of the partnership, because I think even during the Cold War days, there were times when in Washington, at least, it was seen that the US's objectives in terms of containing the threat of communism and Pakistan's objectives as part of that partnership were not in full alignment. And that Pakistan's overarching interest was actually in building up its security capabilities vis-a-vis India. This was shortly after partition, and Pakistan found itself a weaker state and was using its relationship with the US in order to gain ground in the security space. And I think it took a while for Washington to fully appreciate that, and there were some tensions that came out of that lack of a full overlap in objectives. I think when we fast forward a bit to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, that was a time when our interests actually were in closer alignment. The US was looking to drive the Soviets out of Afghanistan after their invasion, and Pakistan was happy to support that process, particularly given the significant amounts of security assistance that came with not just US, but also Saudi support. And the US deferred to Pakistan in terms of where those dollars were directed, such that Pakistan was able to privilege the groups that it saw as most in keeping with its own security and strategic interests in Afghanistan. Fast forward again to post-2001, after the attacks on the World Trade Center, and we find ourselves again in partnership, though over time it becomes increasingly clear that our objectives in Afghanistan are in many ways in conflict, that Pakistan was looking to provide support to the Taliban as a hedge against an ultimately unfavorable outcome in Afghanistan, what it saw as a threatening level of Indian interest, for example, and the US was looking to defeat the Taliban, and that those policies were in direct conflict over time, but nonetheless that now that the US is withdrawn from Afghanistan, Pakistan did play a part in bringing the Taliban to the table. We're at this moment, right, where I think we kind of catch our collective breath after these ups and downs in the roller coaster that this relationship has been. And my hope going forward is that, you know, both sides can take a close look at their own interests and at the interests of one another, and find where there are genuine areas of overlap, rather than what I think we have been doing, which is operating under the assumption that perhaps our interests are more aligned than there actually are, or that with time we can shift the interests of the other. I think over the past 7 decades, we have seen that that is likely not to be the case. And so the task for policymakers and indeed outside analysts now is to identify where that area of overlap is in the Venn diagram. Now, you'll hear from Pakistan's standpoint the importance of geoeconomics, for example, of the climate issue after the recent floods. From the US's standpoint, we heard recently from a Pentagon official that, the underlying issues that are of greatest concern to the US in Pakistan today continue to be on the security side. It's issues of counterterrorism and also of Pakistan's nuclear program. And so to my mind, those structural challenges will continue going forward. But I do hope that, in this moment of reflection, perhaps, to my mind, the relationship is actually at a better state than I might have expected. I don't think this is a moment of abandonment. For example, going back to some of at least the perceptions on the Pakistan side of previous dips in the relationship. And going forward, I do hope there are areas of overlapping interests that we can find. But my caution would be that we need to both go in with eyes wide open in terms of what our underlying interests are, and make sure that there is at least closer to full alignment than perhaps we've seen in some past times of cooperation.
Interesting answer. I think you're completely right about the part, like, for example, in the mid-90s, when that time period was specifically strained in our relationship between the two countries. My next question is, just this month, the White House unveiled the new national security strategy, and last week the Department of Defense unveiled the new national defense strategy. Both these strategies outline that the competition with Russia and China are the main focus now. Keeping this in mind, where do you think South Asia fits in?
Yeah, so I think great power competition was the framework of both documents, and it's central to how strategic dynamics are likely to develop in South Asia going forward, right? So when you look at, especially in this case, the US-China rivalry, there are likely to be second-order impacts that play out across South Asia, most prominently because the China-Pakistan relationship is quite close, as is the US-India relationship. Now, I do think that perhaps seen from the outside, those partnerships appear a bit closer than perhaps they might be in reality. I know that there are areas of tension and friction on both sides, but nonetheless, it is a set of relationships that directly ties South Asia to this broader great power competition framework that we're seeing coming out of Washington, D.C. And so thinking about, for example, the future of US-Pakistan relations, the fact that Pakistan is so closely tied with China, and similarly that the US is building out its partnership with India, that's going to be a constraint. And it's a structural issue that we will have to work around. Another area where I think this is likely to come up, and that our program has done some thinking on, is, in the context of the regional rivalry between India and Pakistan, India is increasingly seeing what it calls a collusive two-front threat between China and Pakistan, where it suspects that the two sides are likely to work together to create complications for India, both on its northern border, the line of actual control, and along the western front with the line of control and the international border. So going forward, managing those threat perceptions is going to be a challenge. Similarly, in terms of potential future crises between India and Pakistan, looking at the role that third parties have traditionally played in helping both sides manage their differences and avoid escalation in the context of the US-China rivalry, I think third-party crisis management is likely to be a bit more difficult than it has been in the past. And that's something that regional policymakers should keep in mind in gauging risk and the potential for inadvertent escalation.
You mentioned the threat perception with respect to India. Do you think the US can work with Pakistan to alleviate India with respect to this threat perception?
You know, I think it's important from Washington's standpoint, the dehyphenation of the India-Pakistan, of the US-India and US-Pakistan relationships is very important and is something that we've seen recently, right? Washington has demonstrated that even as it continues to pursue the partnership with New Delhi, with China being the key focus there, it's also able to work with Pakistan to provide significant amounts of money in flood relief. We've just seen as well the F-16 sustainment package that went through last month. And so I think, you know, going forward, this is something that Washington is aware of in terms of those perceptions, but also is keen to continue its relationship with both sides. I think from Pakistan's standpoint, where this is challenging and where I would encourage analysts in Pakistan to put some thought is very often, I think Pakistan sees, you know, within the context of its own threat perceptions and perceived regional rivalry, sees India as being largely focused on Pakistan. And within that context, US security assistance going to India looks particularly threatening from Pakistan's standpoint. Of course, sitting here in Washington and in New Delhi as well, India has increasingly recognized that China is its greatest strategic threat, and that the assistance the US is providing to India is very much focused on enabling it to defend itself against the threat from China. For example, like we've seen along its northern border in the summer of 2020, when there were clashes breaking out as well as in the maritime domain. And so sitting in Pakistan's shoes and in conversations with Islamabad when I was there in September, one of the key areas of focus, I think, going forward is to be for Pakistan trying to distinguish what assistance going to India is actually focused on Pakistan, or perhaps recognizing some of India's own threat perceptions vis-a-vis China. And this, you know, zooming out a bit, this is the challenge of a trilateral competition where it's three-sided and everyone has different threat perceptions. And all the players are nuclear armed. So it raises the stakes in a really significant way. And there's no clear roadmap for how we've been able to manage these challenges going forward. For example, the Cold War was largely a dyad. And so I think it will really take some novel thinking, hopefully coming out of South Asia in the coming years to help us navigate and manage this new competition.
Right. My next question is, many of the US allies in Southeast Asia have good or reasonable relations with China. They, even with respect to the disputes, they tend to have a reasonable working relationship with China. They also undertake significant amounts of trade with China, and Thailand, for example, also undertakes bilateral military drills with China. So with this in mind, do you think there's space with respect to the new national security strategy, which would allow American allies and partner states to undertake cooperation with the US's competitors in the limited terms, so they could pursue their own national interests?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that the national security strategy tries to do very clearly is to reject the idea of camps, right? We often hear this criticism of US policy as requiring that states are with us or against us. And the NSS is very explicit in saying, you know, that it makes space for cooperation on shared priorities. And I quote, even if they, meaning states, do not agree with us on all issues. And so within that, it identifies this dual challenge that we're facing in the world today, right? Seen from Washington's perspective, I think China represents a threat to the rules-based international order. And that is something that is top of mind for policymakers in the US. But paired with that are global challenges, transnational challenges like climate change and the impacts of global warming, like Pakistan is seeing very directly. And policymakers in this document recognize that we have to be able to cooperate in order to tackle these global challenges, even between the US and China, right? So finding that balance on issue-based cooperation, if indeed it is genuine, is something that I think the strategy lays out well. And then maybe a little bit closer to home for Pakistan, the NSS is providing space for states to be able to cooperate with the US, even if it's not on all issues. And so I think there is perhaps a bit more nuance than is typically projected onto US policy. I think we recognize the world as it is, and this strategy is an attempt to grapple with that. But that's not to say that there won't be complications there, right? And managing cooperation on kind of global transnational threats, and also what from Washington's perspective is, a threat to the rules-based international order that the PRC's behavior represents. That's going to be a difficult balance to strike going forward.
So my next question is, there is no mention of Pakistan in neither the NSS or the NDS. You've stated this question is in two parts. Firstly, you've stated that Pakistan is not being mentioned in the NSS can be sort of a positive development. Similarly, the second part of the question is, again, is Pakistan's no mention in the NDS also a positive development of sorts?
Yeah, so what I meant by that, and this is coming from a commentary that I'd written for the Stimson Center a couple of days after the NSS was released. And I was going back in time and looking at the most recent national security strategy that Washington had released. This was under the Trump administration in 2017. And in it, Pakistan was mentioned several times. I think it's 8 maybe total. And it's important to look at how it's framed, right? I think it can be tempting to say, oh, we were mentioned, so we're important. But Pakistan in 2017 was framed as the provider of safe havens to terrorist groups. It was criticized for its support to the Taliban. It was seen as a potential source of nuclear escalation in the event of an India-Pakistan conflict. So being mentioned does not necessarily translate to a positive appraisal in this document. And that's what I meant when I said, maybe no news is good news for Pakistan. And I think indeed this hit home in a way because the morning after this commentary was published, we saw the remarks from President Biden at the fundraiser in California when Pakistan was mentioned. And, I think he, in kind of an offhand way, was hearkening back to some of the assessments from, a decade or more ago when Pakistan was seen as one of the most dangerous countries in the world, was referencing the challenges of political cohesion right now in Pakistan, which are very real. And so, it was very quickly on Twitter, at least, a shift from some Pakistan-based analysts kind of, complaining about the fact that Pakistan wasn't mentioned. And then we saw the mention and perhaps that was not all that it was imagined to have been. So, looking at that, I think the fact that Pakistan didn't come up suggests that there's space there, even if there's not, a shift towards a positive mention. The very fact that there is an absence of some of the criticism that we've seen previously suggest an opening. And I also pointed out the climate focus of the NSS. Obviously, it was drafted and cleared and released before the full impacts of Pakistan's floods were seen. But it does recognize the Indo-Pacific as, I think it calls it the epicenter of the climate crisis. And within that, there is space for perhaps a new framework. I would say, similarly for the NDS. And overall, perhaps the takeaway here, and one of the points that I was making on my trip to Islamabad that I think is sometimes difficult to grasp outside of Washington, is just the bandwidth challenges that policymakers in Washington are facing today. There are so many threats, so much going on with competition with China, certainly, and that playing out in the Indo-Pacific. We haven't even talked about Russia and Ukraine, but that is top of mind as well. We're heading into the midterm elections, and as we saw with the just awful attack on the Speaker of the House's husband over the weekend, there are real concerns about what's going on domestically in the US as well. And so as prominent a role as Pakistan has played in US security policy over the past several decades, and in turn that the US has played in Pakistan, I think that is really diminished. And that is a challenging transition, but one that, if played correctly by both sides, could present some opportunities.
Your mention of the attack on Speaker Pelosi's husband leads into my last question. The national security strategy states that the US is facing a threat from various domestic extremists, violent ones, which have either a prejudice with respect to race or ethnicity, and also have anti-government and anti-authority sentiment in mind. With this, you couple the fact the January 6, 2021 attacks on the Capitol Hill, and as you mentioned, the attack on Speaker Pelosi's husband. Don't you think the US should be focusing more at home to counter radical actors who are diluting the values of democracy, rather than engaging or competing with illiberal states far from its shores?
I think there's a recognition that we have to do both to the extent that we can. And that has been, when you look at, for example, the Biden administration's foreign policy, it can sometimes be criticized as an extension of Trump era policies in some ways, right? Like the shift towards recognizing China as a threat, most prominently. The difference, of course, being working in partnership with our allies and partners. And I think that comes very clearly in the NSS. And we recognize those resource constraints. And part of the goal of the national security strategy, and then on the defense side of integrated deterrence, right, is leveraging the expertise and strength that our partner and allies can bring to bear against these foreign policy challenges, because simultaneously, as you point out, there's a lot of work to be done on the home front. We are headed into the midterm elections, and I think the work of the January 6th committee in Congress, for example, is a great example of how we are shining a light on some of these issues domestically. Part of the challenge there, of course, is polarization, which is something that's also, of course, playing out not just in the US, also in Pakistan, also around the world. And so, wrapping our arms around this problem is something that will take a great deal of time, and in some ways, is likely to be a key theme, not just for this election cycle, but for the next and next and next, unfortunately. And so over time, I think this will be perhaps one of the defining challenges of this decade, is how the US is able to balance an increasingly complex foreign policy environment with a domestic environment that's equally challenging. I think there's typically a line that Washington can focus on kind of one crisis at a time, one key challenge at a time. And right now we have three. We have China, we have the war in Ukraine, which no one sought except for Vladimir Putin, and has sucked a lot of air and attention away from other priorities. And we have climate. And that's just on the foreign policy side. That's not even getting to domestic policy. So, I think to my mind, this is a reminder of the importance of working internationally with partners, with allies, especially on those transnational threats where we can. But also, goes to show that the US is likely to be able to play less of an active role in places like Pakistan, where it has been, such a central part of security policy going forward. And so, like I said, that creates an opportunity, but the ball is very much in Pakistan's court to identify future steps in the relationship, to find those areas of genuine overlap, and to make the case in Washington, not just to government, but also to private sector. So I think going forward, that's likely to be the new balance that we strike.
Thank you, Ms. Threlkeld, for a wonderful interview.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.